Welcome to Dear SQL DBA, a podcast for SQL Server database administrators. I'm Kendra Little. Today we're going to talk about a question that I was asked multiple times recently at the SQL Pass Summit in Seattle. I had 3 different people come to me and all essentially asked the same question. They said that recently they've gotten the ability to upgrade their SQL servers. And while they're interested in going to SQL Server 2016, their management is a little concerned because 2016 came out pretty recently. And their management says, hey, well, wouldn't it be safer if we went to SQL Server 2014? Now, the folks asking me the question said, what I really want is, do you have some reasons that could help me persuade my management as to why 2016 would make a real difference for us? And even 3 weeks ago, I had a host of features that I could talk about these folks with as to why I think SQL Server 2016 is an exciting release for all editions of SQL Server. But as of yesterday, with the release of SQL Server 2016 Service Pack 1, we have even more reasons why upgrading to SQL Server 2016 is very, very attractive for you. So let's talk about SP1. First off, managers love Service Pack 1. It gives them a warm, fuzzy feeling of safety, even though bugs can happen in service packs and you have to test those service packs as well. You can't just assume everything works. There is something about Service Pack 1 that just sort of delights the IT manager and makes them feel that really it's time. It's ready. It's time. But also, this service pack does something that no SQL service pack has done before. This service pack makes a bunch of features for developers that used to only be available in Enterprise Edition. Those features will now be available in SQL Server Standard Edition, Web Edition, and even Express and Local DB editions. Microsoft wants to make it so that when you're developing an application, you can use even the advanced features in SQL Server for the application when it starts out small. You still may need to eventually go to Enterprise Edition. Enterprise Edition still has a lot of benefits. Enterprise Edition lets you use more memory. It lets you use more cores. Enterprise Edition has cool high availability and disaster recovery options that you don't have in the lower editions, right? Not every Enterprise Edition feature is going downward. It's mostly programmability features and security features that are becoming more widespread. Things like transparent data encryption are also still Enterprise Edition features. So I encourage you, before you talk to your management about all the cool stuff you can get, there's a matrix that Microsoft has published that is great, that points out the features by edition and what's changing. And I have a link to this on my blog in the blog post for this Dear SQL DBA episode. So click on that link and look at the features before you go talk to folks, because it's a lot of features, but Enterprise Edition still has its selling points. And for example, online index rebuilds, still an enterprise feature, right? But there's a lot of cool stuff in these lower editions. Standard Edition, now you get way more bang for your licensing buck in terms of the features you can use in your applications. And Express Edition is actually free, right? So you're getting even more for free in Express Edition. What features might you use right away and how? Well, most of this is developer focused, but there are some features in here that I think, looking at them, I'm like, oh, well, as a DBA, I would have a really strong inclination to start using this soon. Database snapshots. I love the database snapshot feature in SQL Server, and the only bad thing about it, well, shouldn't say only, there is a couple caveats with database snapshots, but before, with it being an enterprise-only feature, there wasn't huge use of this. Database snapshots can be very cool for the DBA. So if you're gonna release a quick hotfix to your code base in SQL Server, you can take a database snapshot and create a little point in time moment in SQL Server for that database. You can then roll out the code release. And the only stuff that gets written for your snapshot is data that changes since you created the snapshot. It doesn't create a whole separate copy of your database. It's just tracking that point in time. This is really handy for things like change releases because you now have the view before the change, which can be used for verification after the change. And then when you're completely satisfied that everything looks fine, you can drop the snapshot and keep going. Really convenient, really great. Now, with everything, there's kind of a word of warning. I would be careful using the revert feature. You have a feature where you can say, okay, I want to go back to this snapshot. Now, the first thing to know is you're going to lose any changes that have happened since that snapshot was created, right? You are reverting, but it can also really kind of mess up your transaction log. It essentially uses rebuild code on it, and I've got links to details in that. So I love database snapshots. I would say having them in standard edition can be immediately useful. I'm not necessarily talking about reverting to those snapshots though. Another feature that you could talk about being able to benefit you without changing the code in your applications is data compression. With data compression, you can compress your data in your tables, and I say tables, it's really applied individually. Most of us have clustered indexes, so it's applied to the clustered index and or any non-clustered index you want. So you get to choose, where do I want to use data compression? And you get to choose whether or not you want to use row compression or page compression. The benefits of compression are that the compressed data takes up less space on disk as well as in memory. There can be CPU trade-offs, and well, I should say there are CPU trade-offs. Decompressing data, you're going to burn some extra CPU. And the CPU hit for decompressing an entire page is greater than for decompressing a single row. So generally, row compression, you don't get as much compression, but it's less overhead. Page compression, you get more compression, but it's more overhead for reads and writes because it's compressing the whole page. But you can essentially make better usage of your memory with these. And now you have the option to do that in standard edition, express edition, local DB, web. I keep forgetting editions, right? So these lower editions. This also means that if you use Enterprise Edition for your production SQL Server, but your disaster recovery plan is to restore the database off to a standard edition server, you know it's not gonna, perform as well. It might be a little slow, but it'll be online. Before, this was a problem because if you were using data compression, the database, it would go through the whole restore process and then at the end just sort of be like, oh, can't finish the restore because you're using an enterprise feature. Now that works in standard edition, you can do things like log ship from an enterprise edition to a standard edition server, or if restoring the whole database is your plan, that should work as well. So that, I think, is awesome for database administrators. Another thing that you might, and I do say might, be able to use without a lot of code changes is table partitioning. Now, technically, table partitioning can be done without a lot of developer work. This is what you'll read. And that's kind of technically true, but in practice, usually you do need a combination of developer work and DBA work to really implement table partitioning. You'll see the word transparent used with table partitioning, and it's maybe just a little bit see-through. But so here's the deal. Table partitioning is an awesome feature for managing large tables. You can break the tables up into chunks, and we even now have features like the ability to truncate a specific partition. But it also lets you load a lot of data quickly and then switch it in. Now, For your tables where read performance is really important, if you just partition a table, you can start getting pretty different query plans, and in some cases you might get pretty big query regressions. You may need to rewrite the T-SQL or really carefully tune your indexes to get queries to perform as well as they can against a non-partitioned table. That's why I say it can take developer work and code changes. But you may have some cases that are actually easier than that. You may have some tables that get a lot of writes and that are very rarely read and aren't really read by the application. A lot of people have like logging style tables that are like this, where they only occasionally get read, and it's usually by like support folks. It's not by your actual customers. And for tables like that, using partitioning can help you do things like, okay, well, we want to only keep data for a certain amount of time, and then we're just gonna truncate that old partition. It could help you manage that data a lot better, a lot more easily, and it might not require a bunch of code changes. You might need some code changes to manage it as well, though, right? I do have a free video that I've done on why table partitioning doesn't speed up queries. And in there, I get into some of this stuff about how it doesn't just make all your query plans faster and where it really shines for data management. So if you want more on that, check out my video there. Other things that can convince your boss. So security can be a pretty persuasive thing. And in SQL Server 2016, just in RTM, there were some pretty cool security features that came out and were available in standard edition. So your boss might not be aware that dynamic data masking exists and that that's available in standard. That hasn't changed. It's still in standard. But one thing that has changed with SP1 is that the new always encrypted feature is now available in standard edition, web edition, express edition. You get the picture. And if you have anything like social security numbers or credit cards or personally identifying information in your database that needs to be encrypted, you really want always encrypted as a feature. Always encrypted essentially makes it so that the keys to the kingdom for encryption aren't stored in the database. And it makes it so that if you're the database administrator, you can't just go read that data. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm anywhere near a SQL server that has credit card information in it, I am much happier if there is no possible way I could get access to that data, because it immediately means that I can't do anything with it, and I shouldn't be able to do anything with it. That's good news for you. That's good news for your boss, their boss, as well as for the customers. So if you have that sensitive data always encrypted in standard edition and other editions, may be a really convincing topic for you to talk about. Other exciting things. And here I think is where, in my opinion, this is kind of speculation, but in my opinion, this is kind of one of the really smart things about Microsoft making this available for people. Features like In-Memory OLTP or Hackathon are available in these lower editions. Now, they aren't giving them to you in an unlimited fashion. They're capped. So for In-Memory OLTP, it can only use a certain amount of memory on your instance. The amount of memory it can use varies based on the edition of SQL Server. It can use about 25%, or it can use 25% of the buffer pool memory limit for that edition. So editions already have a limit to the amount of data or memory that you can use for data cache, aka buffer pool. And a limit on these pools for in-memory OLTP, it can use 25% of your cap. So for standard edition, in-memory OLTP will be able to use 32 gigs of memory. And that's really important because if you're using an in-memory table, it has to be resident in memory. And if you're writing and making changes and you don't have enough memory available for the new data to go in, if you're doing an insert, update, or a delete, because it uses versioning behind the scenes, so you've got to have new versions, it will just stop working if it runs out of memory. You can't make more changes until you either make it use less memory or give it more memory. So you've got to be really careful, but I don't think that means you shouldn't use it in standard edition. Here's the thing. You gotta be careful when you start using new features like Inmemory OLTP, and who wants to start using a new feature on your most critical database first? By making these features available in other editions of SQL Server, this gives you encouragement to say, okay, well, we're gonna start getting used to this feature and figure out how to use it, how to monitor it, and how to do cool stuff with it on databases that aren't that important. And if you can particularly have databases where it's not that big a deal if it goes offline and you screw up, that is the perfect place to start experimenting with a new feature. Whenever you start to do anything new, even if it works perfectly, but operationally you run into some issues, human beings are going to screw up. So having a safe place to test is perfect. And having a place in production that's pretty inexpensive is the best thing of all. So the thing that came to my mind first was like, a lot of apps have like databases where you can turn on verbose logging for the app and just shoot a ton of information into this database. And most apps are designed so that if it does this, if it has this feature and the database goes away, it just keeps on going, right? It's kind of like an optional debug mode. So it's like, whatever, if it's not there, I'll just do my thing, because it's not like critical logging. It's just like extra information in case you need it. Databases like that, which are generally put on something like a standard edition instance that isn't, your finest licensing dollar, databases like that are a great place to experiment with tables, with things like Inmemory or possibly Columnstore, right? So you get the ability to be creative. And here's what I think Microsoft is really smart about this. One of the ways to get people to really stick with your product is to get them to start using these features that set you apart. Microsoft has spent tons of development dollars in getting in-memory OLTP and Columnstore indexes to work and adding all of these really cool features to them. The more you can get people starting to use those features and starting to scale up those databases, the more they adopt it, the more they are really going to want to stick with your technology. If it's only available in Enterprise Edition, it's going to take a longer time for people to really adopt that. It's going to take a longer time for you to get feedback on what works well and what people want to be different. So by speeding up adoption, they have the ability to get more info about how these features really work for people, and they're getting a better chance to have fans who are just raving happy fans and who are using all these features, and who then have very successful apps and they scale them up and they start using them even in their most critical databases. So I'm very excited about this for customers as well as for Microsoft. Specifically with Columnstore, Columnstore has a similar limit. You can use it in the lower editions, but it can only use 25% of the buffer pool limit for that edition. And you get a limit on how many cores your queries can use against the Columnstore object. So standard edition can use 2 cores for queries against Columnstore, and Web and Express are single-threaded when running against Columnstore. Now, the memory limit isn't quite as big a deal when it comes to Columnstore, because unless you're talking about a clustered Columnstore index on an in-memory table, because we can now mix these two technologies, unless it's that scenario, if you're just talking about Columnstore on a disk-based table, it doesn't have to all be resident in memory. So there's a limited amount of memory, but it's really the difference between reading from memory or reading from disk. It's faster to read from memory, but we can't read from memory all the time. You do have to make sure that adding the Columnstore index isn't slowing down your inserts, updates, and deletes. You have to make sure that you've picked the right type of Columnstore index. You have a variety to choose from. And you need to make sure that your queries are really getting faster. Columnstore really shines when you've got millions and millions of rows in a table, and the columnar compression helps scanning and aggregating data be much faster for you. So very exciting that Columnstore is available there as well. And the way I would phrase the Columnstore opportunity is similar to Inmemory OLTP. This change allows you to start looking at places where you can test this out, in places that are safer. It lets you be creative with these and your developers be creative with these in more ways and not just in your critical databases. That's really awesome. To help make use all of this easier, we have SQL Server's Query Store. Now, this isn't a change. SQL Server 2016 RTM already had Query Store in all the additions, so it was already awesome. But the awesomeness of Query Store really helps you do this experimenting even in Standard Edition. You can see, okay, we added this Columnstore index. I added a non-clustered filtered Columnstore index to this yesterday. Have my queries actually gotten faster? Are my query plans using it? You can actually tell with Query Store. You can help identify when things are getting slower. You can show when things are getting faster. And it makes it much easier to collaborate with developers as well, because instead of doing things like trying to save off a bunch of giant XML query plans in a spreadsheet, you can bring things up and look at them in the Query Store, because they aren't just things that were like in the cache in SQL Server and might get cleared. So Query Store really makes taking advantage of all these opportunities in a safe way and collaborating with them much, much easier. So finally, the last thing when talking to your management is they've been thinking of SQL Server 2016 as the new kid, right? They think of it as the latest code that's the most dangerous. Well, Microsoft has also shipped SQL Server vNext CTP1. SQL Server 2016 not only has a service pack, but it's now sort of the middle child, right? It's not the youngest anymore. The next version of SQL Server, which will run not only on Windows, but also on Linux, well, I should say, does run on Linux. You can even run it in your Mac via a Docker container. It is currently available for download. This is not a private preview. It is a public preview, and you can download it from Microsoft. Very, very exciting. You can even install tools on your Mac to access SQL Server directly from your Mac. I swear, it's all true. I feel strange actually saying this. Wake me. I may be dreaming. So 2016, of course you should upgrade to 2016. It's not even the new version anymore. So as with everything, I know I'm selling this pretty hard. I'm pretty sold. I mean, with any upgrade, it's always important to test. It's always important to make sure that you've got everything in order for your migration. But I do think that at this point, it's very, very clear that if you have the opportunity to upgrade, you absolutely want to go to 2016, and you really want to look at Service Pack 1. Thanks for joining me for Dear SQL DBA. I'll see you again next week.